Great. Thank you very much, Marcel. I'll go ahead and share our presentation.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. I'll take over later and just manage to bridge the silence while Victoria is sharing the screen. Now it works. Great.
Thank you. Perfect. All right. So as Marcel alluded to, today we're going to present the results of our global study on trust in scientists and their role in society. And we will answer a question that's been posed a lot, as we've heard, namely whether there is a proclaimed crisis of public trust in scientists and whether this proclaimed crisis is real or not. So society is facing many challenges at the moment, as we all know. One of them is climate change. Another one that we have all recently experienced was the COVID-19 pandemic. And what these crises have in common is that they're global in nature. They require collective action to be addressed, which means that no single individual can address sort of all of these issues and challenges. And third, to address these crises, we need evidence-based policymaking. And this is really where trust in science comes into play. Now, let me give you a few examples. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, we've seen people all over the world, from Rome here to New York, who started to wear a mask to protect themselves from the COVID-19 pandemic and to prevent the spread of the virus. But like myself, I guess many people had never worn a mask before, right? So they didn't know whether wearing a mask was actually going to protect them from the virus. But nevertheless, millions of people changed their behavior all over the world because scientists recommended people to wear a mask. So trust in science can also really change the way that people respond to these global crises. Another example here is Sandra Lindsay. She was the first woman in the United States to get vaccinated against COVID-19. And we can imagine that she probably had high levels of trust in the scientists who developed the vaccines, high levels of trust in perhaps the pharmaceutical industries too, who produced the vaccine, trust in the policymakers who, at least in most countries, were recommending people to get vaccinated. And looking at this picture, probably also high levels of trust in the nurse, right, who's just about to administer the vaccine. So we argue that trust in science is really important because they can help us address global crises thanks to evidence-based policymaking. And trust in science is really at the heart of an effective science policy interface. Trust in science can also help individuals to act based on the best available evidence. And as we know from psychology, individuals tend to rely on trusted actors in their decision-making processes. And this is especially the case when people's knowledge levels are low and uncertainties are high, as was, for example, the case at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So back in 2020, Niels and I were wondering, well, if trust in scientists is so important to address these global crises, then, well, what is the level of trust in scientists around the world? Do we have to be concerned about a crisis of trust in scientists or not? And this question was really informed by strong public narratives, newspaper articles, opinion pieces that were published around that time that, for example, asked whether public trust in science will survive the pandemic. Others went further, arguing that the anti-science movement is escalating, and others again saying that distrust of science is increasing in the US, for example, and not just on topics such as climate change. But at the time, there was really very little evidence on a global scale, at least, as to whether we were seeing such a crisis or widespread distrust in science. Also, several books were published that, for example, talked about a crisis of expertise, or indeed claimed that we were seeing a death of expertise. And at the same time, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen people protesting against evidence-based policies, right, such as vaccination. We've seen people take to the street and ask, you know, maybe science just keeps asking questions until it finds what it's looking for. And so in order to sort of address or answer this question, whether we were seeing such a crisis of trust in science, Niels and I decided to investigate this with a global many lab study. What is a many lab study? It's literally what it means. It's many labs all around the world asking the same questions with, for example, the same survey instrument. And so we founded and led the Trust in Science and Science-Related Populism study, or TISP for short, which was a global consortium of 241 co-authors at 179 institutions. And it was really this global, collective, cooperative research approach that allowed us to answer such a complex question. Now, how did the project emerge? How does one set up such a big global consortium? As you know, with many projects, it really started with a conversation that Niels and I had back in September 2020. At the time, I was planning on writing a postdoc mobility grant proposal for the Swiss National Science Foundation and had been doing research on trust in science during my PhD. Niels, on the other hand, had been doing work on science-related populism during his PhD. And so we met to sort of discuss how we could research these two topics in a more global context. Luckily, I was then awarded the postdoc mobility grant, which meant that I had funding to go to Harvard University in the US to really research this topic. So then in January 2022, we really started working on this project together. So we started to set up hypotheses and we started to program the questionnaire. And in June 2020, when we had sort of set up the infrastructure for the project, we published a call for collaboration. At the time, Twitter, or now X, was still very heavily used by researchers. And so we published a call there inviting researchers from all over the world to join our project and to help us research trust in science. And we were really overwhelmed. At this point, the project really sort of exploded, and we had over 400 researchers from all over the world who were interested in joining us for this study. And this was like a very, very positive response. We then programmed and pre-tested the survey once we sort of had set up our consortium and pre-tested the survey in the United States to make sure that all of our measures would work as expected. We then pre-registered all of our research questions and analysis plan in November 22 before starting the data collection. We then collected data for about 3 to 4 months in most countries, and then sort of finalized data collection in August 2023. We then analyzed the data, wrote up the article, and submitted the first publication or the first manuscript in September 2023. So as you can see, this was sort of a very packed timeline that kept Niels and I very busy to really get this project going. Now, how was the project set up? So Niels and I were leading the project as PIs. We also oversaw an expert advisory board. So these were 9 scientists who were experts on survey methodology, trust in science, science communication, cross-cultural research, and they really also guided us in leading this project. Together with 230 researchers all over the world, at 179 different institutions, and we estimate a total budget of $140,000 US. We then led the study, which allowed us to survey almost 72,000 participants in 68 countries that you see shaded here on the map. And we collected data with one questionnaire in 37 different languages. So again, our collaborators were extremely helpful also in translating our survey into all the different local languages. So far, the project has resulted in 4 peer-reviewed publications. We have about 7 papers under review, some public preprints, and really try to also talk about this study at many conferences in order to also really encourage people to use the large public data set that has resulted from this project. And very importantly, I wanted to highlight again that this was a very collaborative project. So this project would really not have been possible without so many fantastic co-authors all over the world. We just wanted to highlight some of them for you here on the map. And this was sort of the overall scale of the project. What you can see here is the valid sample size. So the number of participants that we collected in the different countries. And we're very proud, and this really took a lot of time to also really make sure that we could sample participants in countries that are usually underrepresented in research. So for example, you can see that we collected data in 12 African countries, and these are countries that are usually, not very well represented in research. And what was also very important to us in this project was really also to address issues of parachute science practices. And we addressed that by having local collaborators in almost all of the countries that we surveyed. Now, I won't go into too much detail about the data and the methods, but we're very happy to answer any questions that you may have at the end. Just very briefly, this survey was a cross-sectional online survey in 37 languages, and we had quotas in place for age and gender. How do we recruit participants? Well, participants were recruited through an online access panel. So we worked with different market research companies, mostly with Bilendi and Respondi, but in some countries we also work with different market research companies. And this really allowed us to collect a sample of almost 72,000 participants in 68 countries. We also weighted our data, so we applied post-hoc stratification in order to really also have estimates that were nationally representative for age, gender, and education. And lastly, very importantly, all of our data, codes, and materials are publicly available. And we also really put a lot of effort into making sure that our findings were fully and easily reproducible. Now, our study focused on 4 main topics. One, obviously, what is the state of trust in scientists around the world? The second topic is what explains trust. So what leads people to be more or less trusting of scientists? Third, we looked at people's perceptions of the role of scientists in society and policymaking. So to what extent people, for example, wish for scientists to take a more active role in policymaking. And lastly, we looked at people's desired research priorities. So we asked people to what extent, for example, they think people should, researchers should try to improve public health. Now, moving on to the first and perhaps also the main result of our study. So what is the level of trust in scientists around the world? This sort of is summarized in this one figure here. It's a little small, but I still hope that you can see. So what you can see here are the mean levels of trust in scientists around the world in all of the 68 countries that we analyzed. And we assess trust in scientists on a scale from 1, very low trust, to 5, very high trust. And what you can see here is that the global mean is around 3.6. So this leads us to conclude that we're seeing overall moderately high levels of trust in scientists. And what is also very important to note here is that we find no country where the levels of trust in scientists were below the scale midpoint of 3. So you see, even though in Albania, for example, trust is the lowest from all the countries that we investigated, trust in scientists is still sort of at the scale midpoint. Now, you can also see that trust is highest in countries such as Egypt, India, Nigeria, and Kenya, and lowest in especially post-Soviet countries. Now, where is Switzerland? Some of you might have spotted it already. Switzerland is here. It's just below the global average, actually, with a mean of 3.45. But you can still see that it is sort of in line with neighboring countries such as Germany, France, and Italy. And with this, I pass on to Niels, who will tell you more about how we assess trust in scientists.
Thank you, Victoria. Yeah, because we did not really just ask people, how much do you trust scientists? We used a couple of questions, 12 to be precise. And these 12 questions covered 4 dimensions, 4 components of trust in scientists, 4 components that have been frequently described in the scientific literature. And they comprise competence. So do I think that scientists do their job well? Are they experts? Are they qualified? Integrity is the second dimension. Do I think that scientists are honest or dishonest, sincere? Benevolence is a third dimension or component of trustworthiness of scientists that is frequently described, which means, like, do you think that scientists are concerned or not concerned about others' well-being, people's well-being? Do they act in the best interest of the public? And third, openness, which is less prominently described in literature, but still an important component of trust in scientists. So we measured that as well with 3 questions, such as how much or little attention do scientists pay to others' views? How open are they to kind of engage with the public? And here you see 1 question for each of these dimensions, and overall we have 12 questions. so 3 per dimension. The takeaway from this slide is competence is a dimension that ranks quite or comparably strongly high compared to the other dimensions. So the people worldwide do strongly believe that scientists are experts and know what they are doing. The integrity and benevolence dimensions also score comparably high, but there you see, well, we have some parts of the public which do not think that scientists are honest, or think that they are dishonest, and are believing that scientists are not concerned about people's well-being. And when it comes to the openness dimension, we find, well, this ranks even a little lower. Still, people, considerable parts of the public worldwide, or in the 68 countries, believe that scientists pay attention to others' views. But here, our survey respondents were a little more critical, with as much as, 23% disagreeing or saying they pay little attention to others' views. And there we go. Next component of our survey, of our paper that we present today is, Victoria mentioned that, what are explanatory factors of scientists, of trust in science? What are predictors, correlates? What can we say about the people with high or low trust? And we measured a bunch of other variables, such as gender, age, education, income, also some attitudes to science, and we also had some country level indicators. What do we find? We see that the global average, 68 country average, we find that trust is higher among people who are female, older, have higher formal education, have higher income, and live in urban places, in cities. These are relatively small effects here, but still we find that they are significant, and can say, well, trust is a little higher in these age groups and these demographic groups. When it comes to political or ideological views, we asked for political orientation and used 2 questions for that. The first one was distinguishing between left-leaning and right-leaning views, and the second one was between conservative and liberal views. And what I find here is that conservatives tend to trust scientists less across the world, and right-leaning people have actually a little more higher trust in scientists. But we'll get to that later. Religiosity, maybe that's also interesting, is associated with higher trust in scientists worldwide. Might also seem a little counterintuitive. One might think, well, and other studies have shown that that high religiosity in Christian countries, that's important, is linked to lower trust in scientists, because there are some conflicts between science, scientific knowledge, methods, and so on, and certain and theories, evolution theory, for example, and religious doctrines. However, it's interesting that we do not find this association in Muslim countries. So there we find that higher religiosity is usually linked to higher trust in scientists. And collaborators from these countries said, well, this makes sense, this is plausible, because in Muslim faith, in Islam, scientific expertise, knowledge, education goes hand in hand, well along with Muslim faith and the Quran, for example. Maybe just briefly on the right side, we also measured some attitudes to science. There we see stronger effects. So people who perceive that science offers much benefit to them and the public trust scientists more. That's also plausible. People with populist views about science tend to trust scientists less. Also plausible. And then we had a bunch of country level indicators, not many significant effects here. One thing maybe to point out here is that we do find an association of the Gini index and trust in scientists, which means in countries where we have higher income inequality, trust in scientists is actually also a little higher. Well, we can discuss this finding in detail later. I think I'll move on now. We have some explanations for that, but yeah, maybe in the Q&A later. I mentioned that there's a positive relationship of right-leaning political orientation and conservative political orientation. That there's a positive correlation of right-leaning political orientation and trust in scientists. And there's a negative, so there's also a positive link between conservative political orientation and, lower trust in scientists. I'm mixing this up a little bit. What we see on this map here is that this differs across countries. So there are some countries where conservatives do have lower trust in scientists. And these are colored in blue or turquoise or green, whatever this is. And but there are still also some other countries colored in red where liberals have lower trust in scientists. And well, maybe that's important here it's also important to note that there are many countries where there's no clear link, there's no clear kind of polarization over trust in scientists along political lines. But we find that in many Western countries, including Switzerland, it's the conservatives have lower trust. But in Indonesia, for example, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Nigeria, people who identify with liberal views have lower trust in scientists, which we explain with the fact that in some of these countries, actual liberal or also left-leaning political leaders are strong and have proclaimed anti-science attitudes and resentment. So their followers might actually adopt them and also support anti-science views or have lower trust in scientists than. Third aspect, science, the role of science and society and policy making. What do people think about that? We gave our respondents 5 questions or 5 statements and asked them for how much they agree or disagree with them. For example, scientists should work closely with politicians to integrate scientific results into policy making. And what we see here is, well, there's overwhelming or quite significant support across the world that scientists especially should communicate about science with the general public. Last statement here. Also, there is considerable support for an active role of scientists in policymaking. Should integrate scientific results. Scientists should be more involved in the policymaking process. There are some critical parts of the public, around 20%, but the majority across the world support an active role of scientists in society and policy making. They are a little more critical about advocacy. Scientists should actively advocate for specific policies. There we see at least that around 23% of the public of our sample disapprove of that. So you may wonder now, how does Switzerland compare to that? And if we have a look at the country level results for Switzerland, we see a slightly different numbers, but a similar pattern. And I'll compare this now. So, for example, in Switzerland, there's also overwhelming support for the last statement. Scientists should communicate about science with the general public. The numbers for the first and the third statement are also kind of similar. In Switzerland, we have a little more support for scientists working closely with politicians to integrate their scientific results into policymaking, and also for scientists communicating their findings to politicians. However, and that's interesting, I think, is in Switzerland, we have a little less support for the second item. So a little less support for active advocacy of scientists. There are only 42% approve of that, still 42%, but there's 27% disapproving of that. Last point, desired research priorities. We ask people, how strongly do you believe that scientists should prioritize these goals? We ask them for 4 goals. And how much do you believe that scientists actually tackles these goals, addresses these goals? And we ask for 3 goals or challenges which scientists and science might do research on. Improving public health, solving energy problems, reducing poverty, and developing defense and military technology. And these are, again, the global results here. We see that for the first three goals, we can say that for scientists in the views of the public kind of over-prioritize these goals. So they under-prioritize these goals. So scientists should prioritize these goals. Well, the demands for that are quite high, but the belief that science actually tackles these goals are comparably lower, whereas it's the other way around. For the fourth goal, developing defense and military technology, this is, in the views of the public, tends to be over-prioritized. More research than we actually need, to put it to put it very simply. How does Switzerland compare here? We find for the first two goals, it's quite similar to the global average. But for reducing poverty and developing defense and military technology, we have the same overall picture, but it's more pronounced, it's stronger. So reducing poverty is much more under-prioritized, if you will, in Switzerland, perceived as under-prioritized compared to the world average. And this is mainly driven by lower agreement with the statement that science actually tackles this goal, 2.5 agreement only. And that's the global average, and here we see the Swiss results. And for the last goal, we see that Swiss people tend to believe even more strongly than other countries in the world that developing defense and military technology are over-prioritized. So there are considerably less people believe that scientists should prioritize that goal. So we do not only provide findings for Switzerland. You can have a look at all the countries. We won't do that now because that will take a while, but you can do that. We have a dedicated, developed an online data visualization interface, so to say, and you can access that via the QR code and also through our website. You can play around with the data, have a look at the different countries, compare them, and also run your own kind of analyses with regards to the other infographics that I showed you. And if that's not enough for you, you can have a look at the data yourself, which we published also along with the data set. So we also published all the other variables which I didn't talk about today. For example, variables about populist attitudes to science. It's much about science communication, information use, climate change emotions, for example, is included. So this data set is open. You can use it or whatever, recommend it to someone. And also, you can have a look at the original publication of the findings that we are presenting today on the left-hand side here, on the left side, which includes many more details and much more discussion of why there are certain findings. So I will go to the conclusion slides now. What does that mean? And how can we summarize the findings? So generally, trust in scientists is moderately high across the world. Trust is lower in certain countries, such as Russia, former Soviet republics, and also in certain population groups, like conservatives, like younger people, for example, like rural populations. The public wishes for scientists to be involved in society and policy making, so there's relatively strong approval for that. It's also important to include public perceptions of research priorities and so on in scientific research and deciding on what to do research on. And if you look at Switzerland, well, trust is slightly below the 68 country average, but comparable to neighboring countries. Research on military and defense technologies are kind of over-prioritized, at least according to public opinion in Switzerland. What does that mean for science communication and also for communication in higher education institutions, also for the communication efforts of other organizations, NGOs, and involved in the science communication landscape in Switzerland, such as Sciences et Cité. I saw you, Philip, so referencing them. Scientists want to be may want to be more open to dialogue is something that we can infer from our findings, because you remember the openness dimension on the trustworthiness scale ranked a little lower. So there, scientists might want to improve on, show more openness to dialogue and a more willingness to really engage with publics. And this dialogue should be, we would argue, genuine in that sense that it should not really just be using dialogical science communication formats for the sake of it. So go on social media, put out some posts, but then really doesn't really have a look at the comments. But having conversations via comments, via also outside social or digital media, via science cafes, conferences, public events, talks, lectures, science fairs, and so on. That's something that might actually foster the perceived openness of scientists. This requires obviously support, or this can not always be done by scientists themselves. Sometimes they are not trained. Sometimes they feel uncomfortable for that. Sometimes they don't have the time and financial resources for that. So it needs higher education institution communicators, NGOs, and so on, who support science communication. It also needs institutional recognition and financial resources, as I mentioned. Another thing to think about and to discuss maybe also later is our ethical considerations. So do we actually always want more trust? Is it really a bad thing that Switzerland ranks below the world average of trust in science? It still has a considerable level of trust in scientists. So trust in science might also be like the maximum level of trust in science might also count as kind of like a blind trust in science. And that's maybe not very worthwhile, because having some sort of skepticism, checks and balances of scientists could also be beneficial and worthwhile. And also, I mentioned that we can't force scientists and scholars into doing engagement if they feel uncomfortable or untrained, don't have the resources, do it in their spare time. So that's also something to consider here. What are challenges? Well, more openness might perhaps also harm trust in science among some people, because you may say, well, scientists should do their job without listening to lay people, quote unquote. Scientists are the experts. I don't want them to be open to others' views, for example. That's maybe another like normative dimension that should be considered. Dialogue and participation, you know this pretty well, I think, often involve only those with high trust, positive attitudes to science, who probably all usually preach to the choir of the converted, the common saying. So their ceiling effects, increasing public trust via dialogue might not be as efficient as one might imagine. It's more important also to speak and communicate with the more skeptical audiences. And dialogue might come with trade-offs. So there can be public backlash, hostility, and criticism if scientists go out and speak and communicate. And this requires countermeasures for and support for victims, also sometimes provided by institutions. I think I'll leave it with this kind of cautionary note in the end. But I think there's many more things to discuss. Also, we're looking forward to questions and comments about the results. Thank you very much for having us, and thanks for your attention.